Rich boy pours wine. On black girl, his parents laugh. Until she cancels their $1.2 billion deal, stand still. I want to see how filthy someone like you looks under real crystal. Chase Ashford drawled, his lips curling into a sneer as he raised the crystal glass above Camille Westbrook's head. The chandelier light caught the deep red liquid, reflecting a hue that looked eerily like blood. Camille, a 16-year-old black girl, stood motionless in the grand hall of the Ashford estate, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a startling clarity, as if she instinctively knew this moment would follow her for the rest of her life. Chase's grin widened as the wine spilled, striking Camille's forehead, sliding along her cheek, soaking into the champagne-colored silk dress she had spent weeks altering by hand to make it fit just right. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room, swift and cold, like blades cutting through air. A few guests lifted their hands to their mouths, but no one stepped forward. No one dared to interrupt the Ashfords' cruelty on their own domain. Clarissa Ashford giggled, clapping her hands with glee, as though she had just witnessed a magic trick. "Good boy, Chase. Now she looks like she fits the setting," she said in a shrill, triumphant voice, holding up her phone to capture the moment. In the back, Gregory Ashford stepped closer, a blade-thin smile stretching across his lips. "Don't let it stain the carpet. This gala wasn't designed for her kind." Camille remained still, unblinking, not lifting a hand to wipe the wine away. Her silence was not submission. It was armor, as if a conversation was happening deep inside her, one only she could hear. Part of her wanted to scream, to cry, to ask why a family with everything could allow themselves to treat a harmless girl like this. But another part held still upright, strong enough to make their cruelty seem small and pathetic. That year was 2004, and Chicago was caught in the coldest winter it had seen in many years. Outside the estate, snow lay in thick layers. Inside, the warmth from hundreds of guests and the echo of false laughter painted a portrait of prosperity the Ashfords were desperate to maintain. But at that moment, all the glamour only made the sight of red wine streaking down Camille's skin feel even more brutal and shameful. A few older women shook their heads and turned away, as if they had seen this before and would see it again. A group of teenagers nearby lifted their phones, their screens casting a pale blue glow over their faces. Their silence echoed the silence of the whole room, a silence that wasn't innocent. It was complicity, carefully wrapped in the etiquette of the elite. Clarissa laughed louder as Camille stayed perfectly still. She doesn't even dare to speak. Gregory crossed his arms, nodding in satisfaction, as though they had just taught a child her place in the world. But none of them realized they had just made the gravest mistake of their lives. None of them knew the girl standing before them was not just a distant guest. None of them knew that one day the very person they humiliated would become the woman powerful enough to drag the entire Ashford empire into ruin. Camille bowed her head slightly, not in deference, but as if she were etching the moment into memory, branding it like a milestone. The wine kept dripping, turning the silk dress a deeper shade of red. Its cold sting tightened her skin. Then she lifted her head, eyes dry and steady, holding one thing only, a silent vow no one else in the room could hear. She turned, walked away, not wiping her face, not saying a word. Her steps landed softly on the marble floor, steady, and oddly enough they carried a kind of quiet majesty that not a single Ashford noticed. Clarissa laughed again, unaware that the moment she found so amusing would mark the beginning of a chain of events that could shatter everything they owned. Back then, all they saw was a black girl in a dress soaked with wine. But if they had looked more closely, they would have seen that her eyes held no shame. They held a warning, a glimpse of the day when everything would be turned on its head. They poured wine on a girl. But what they awakened was an air the world would not be able to ignore. Before we move on to the next part of the story, if something in what you've just heard touches a quiet corner of your memory, take a moment. Subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel. Click like if you believe this story deserves to be heard, and share it with someone you think will understand. Stories like Camille's don't only live in books or on television. Sometimes they live right beside us, in the familiar hallways we pass through, in the glances we once ignored. Where are you watching this from? Leave a comment with the name of your city, your country, or the place where you're listening to this story, so we can see just how far Camille's journey has reached. We're always here to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. Thank you for staying. Now, let us continue with part 2 of the story. Camille kept walking, the red wine dripping down her spine in slow, deliberate rivulets, painting a dark trail on the silk dress she had once cherished as a quiet point of pride. But what left the grand hall stunned into silence wasn't the ruined gown. It was the fact that she did not tremble. She didn't wipe her face. She didn't look back. She did not collapse. From the beginning to the end, she never even blinked, and that stillness left people unsure whether they were witnessing immense courage or the numb paralysis of a pain that had been buried too deep for too long. Yet to many of those watching, her composure only made their silence heavier, more shameful. Clarissa Ashford was still laughing, that sharp, shrill kind of laugh that made it seem as though a 16-year-old girl were nothing more than a puppet on her stage, a thing she could mock at will. A few guests pressed their lips together, trying to appear thoughtful, as if detachment could shield them from the ugliness of the moment, but then they turned away, pretending to admire the artwork, adjusting their ties, or busying themselves with the champagne flutes in their hands. That turning away was the cruelest act of the evening. Not Chase's pour, not Clarissa's laughter, but the cold composure of the entire room. The women in shimmering gowns pretended to see nothing, casting only brief glances before looking away, as though bowing their heads to a truth they did not want to confront. The men in polished tuxedos sighed, shook their heads slightly, as though what they had witnessed was merely a breach of etiquette, not a public humiliation inflicted on a girl in plain sight. No one stood up. No one told Chase to stop. No one asked Clarissa to hold her laughter. Camille knew they saw everything. She could feel their eyes brush over her, then quickly turn aside as if her shame were something contagious. The only thing they cared to protect was not her. They were protecting the party, the luxury, the pristine white carpet, and most of all, their relationships with the Ashfords, the family that controlled a staggering portion of the city's entertainment and real estate projects. Camille passed by a group of teenagers. One blonde girl still had her phone lifted, recording, but when her eyes met Camille's just for an instant and found no shame there, no submission, only a poised calm. The girl quietly lowered her phone and turned away, uncertain whether she felt admiration or guilt. Gregory Ashford curled his lips into a thin smirk and turned toward the banquet table, as if what had just unfolded was nothing more than a hiccup in the evening's program. He said something to the nearby guests, and they chuckled on cue. The entire hall buzzed with polite conversation and the rustle of fine fabrics, with classical music weaving through the air like wallpaper, but not a single word. Not one note of concern was meant for the girl who had just been degraded in front of them. A few servers glanced at Camille with pity in their eyes, but none stepped closer. They knew the invisible boundaries of this house, boundaries that no one was allowed to cross, not even in the face of a child being humiliated. Still, Camille walked, and her silence made the laughter behind her feel strangely hollow. Clarissa murmured something to the woman beside her, perhaps a remark about the ruined dress, or how red wine oddly suited darker skin tones, a kind of humor that left a chill in the spine of anyone truly listening. What was strange was that Camille did not feel her blood rush to her face. Her heart did not pound. Everything inside her seemed to go still, so deep it felt submerged. And yet it was that stillness that held her upright. She didn't bow her head. She didn't apologize for existing. When she reached the threshold that led out to the garden, Camille paused for a breath, not to gather strength, but to look back. She looked at the room behind her, bathed in golden light that fell over the faces of those who had turned away. The expensive gowns, the perfect tuxedos, the stiff smiles of people resuming their conversations as if nothing had happened. And in the center of it all, Clarissa still laughing, Chase still smug, and Gregory still standing like a sovereign, surveying his lands. In that moment, Camille understood something vital. They weren't afraid of her. They were confident that someone like her would bow her head and disappear. They believed that shame would silence her forever. But Camille did not tremble. She did not panic, and that unwavering composure was the one thing that unsettled the entire room in a way they couldn't explain. They believed they had won. But they didn't see what Camille carried with her as she pushed open the door to the garden, a silence that was not surrender, but the seed of a future they had never imagined. The door closed behind Camille with a quiet click, and the sounds of the party were instantly swallowed by the winter garden's silence. The music vanished, the laughter faded. All that remained was the sharp chill in the air and the scent of red wine soaked into her skin. Her steps began to slow, her hands still loose at her sides, but something in her gaze had shifted. It wasn't pain. It was awakening. Camille Westbrook, 16 years old, stood alone beneath the dark silhouette of bare trees, and in her mind, echoed the voice of a man the world had never linked to her name. Harold Westbrook, founder of Westbrook Financial Group, one of the largest private finance firms in the United States, a man Wall Street respected politicians measured their words around and tycoons quietly envied. To the media, Harold was a symbol of black excellence rising from poverty. But to Camille, he was a father who had always reminded her that true power never rested in what people could see. It lived in what they could never predict. Her father once told her that silence, when used well, could make your enemies lose their way. Camille had never carried the Westbrook name in public, using her mother's maiden name Vance throughout her school years. Her mother, a literature professor at Northwestern University, had raised her far from Harold's world of power and wealth. She grew up in Evanston in an old, quiet house. She took the city bus to school, ate cold chicken sandwiches for lunch, and spent her afternoons reading in the library. No one knew that the girl walking those hallways was the only child of a man quietly controlling nearly a tenth of the investment capital in Chicago. Camille never bragged about who her father was. She never used the family name to cut corners or claim privilege. That was a promise she made with her mother, that if she wanted to stand in the world of grown men, she would walk in on her own 2 feet. But tonight, when the wine ran down her neck and soaked into her spine, she understood something with clarity. There are moments when silence is no longer humility. It is preparation. They didn't know who she was. Clarissa laughed as though she held the strings to a pawn on her chessboard. Gregory spoke like a man used to shaping other people's fates. And Chase moved with the smugness of a prince in a twisted fairy tale where the weak existed solely for the entertainment of the powerful. None of them imagined that in only a few short years, Camille would sit across from them at a negotiation table, holding the kind of power that could rewrite the destiny of the entire Ashford empire. Tonight, they saw a girl who didn't fight back, but they didn't see how every glance that turned away, every mocking laugh, every cutting word was being etched into Camille's memory like a vow that needed no voice. One day, she would stand before them not to seek revenge, but to remind them that the things they believed to be eternal were far more fragile than they could ever understand. Not because she was Harold Westbrook's daughter, but because she was Camille, a girl who would never forget the sound of silence choked beneath counterfeit laughter, and because she knew that even the grandest empire can be shaken by a single decision made by the person they once dismissed. 20 years had passed since that winter night, yet the memory of the wine glass remained vivid in Camille's mind, as if it had happened only yesterday. Not because she was still wounded by it, but because that very night had laid the foundation for the woman she had become. Camille Westbrook, now 36 years old, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 38th floor of a skyscraper in downtown Chicago. The city stretched out beneath her, its lights pulsing like veins of fire carrying the heartbeat of millions. She wore a perfectly tailored black suit, her hair pulled into a neat bun, her eyes sharp and still like water before a storm. The room behind her was not just an office. It was the headquarters of Westbrook Innovations, one of the fastest-growing fintech companies in the nation. Though the company was not yet a decade old, it had already secured its place among the 200 most influential financial enterprises worldwide. Under Camille's leadership, it had drawn in billions in investment capital and forced the old financial giants to rethink their strategies. The titans who once dismissed the Westbrook name now tracked her every move. In closed-door meetings on Wall Street, her name came up often with varying tones. Some spoke with admiration, others with caution, still others with narrowed eyes and unspoken concern. But all of them, without exception, had come to accept one truth: Camille Westbrook was no longer a figure on the sidelines of power. She was the power. Unlike the heirs who lived off family legacies, Camille spent nothing on yachts, vintage wine, or glittering galas. Most of her time was devoted to data reports, market analysis, and above all, people. She invested in technology not just for profit, but to redefine how Americans accessed financial tools, especially those long left behind. From working-class neighborhoods in South Chicago to rural communities abandoned by traditional banks. Camille brought intelligent, accessible platforms with no collateral requirements, no predatory interest rates. Once again, she chose silence to do something extraordinary. No grand speeches, no media spectacle. But the numbers did not lie. She did not enter the industry to prove anything to the world. She entered because of a promise unspoken, whispered in her mind on a cold gala night 20 years ago. A promise that one day she would not merely stand shoulder to shoulder with those who once looked down on her, but rise far beyond them. Camille was no longer the girl in the silk dress stained with wine. She was the CEO that tech companies hoped to partner with a regular guest at global economic forums, the woman investment firms scrambled to schedule time with. But the most unsettling thing about her was not her financial portfolio, nor her track record. What made her opponents uneasy was her stillness. Camille never spoke more than she needed to. She watched, she remembered, and when the time came, she moved with chilling precision. No rage, no theatrical revenge. She let her success speak in a language louder than words. In a rare interview, when asked about the greatest source of her drive, Camille had only smiled and said that some lessons don't come from books, but from silence in a crowded room. No one quite understood what she meant, and perhaps they didn't need to, because those who needed to understand already did. And soon they would remember with startling clarity what it felt like to watch a 16-year-old girl walk out of a grand hall in silence. The only difference now was she wasn't walking out. She was walking in, as the one in power. One autumn morning, as golden leaves began to gather along the stone path leading into the headquarters of Westbrook Innovations, Camille stepped into her office as she did every day. Her desk was tidy, the natural light spilling through the seamless glass walls, and the soft knock at the door from her personal assistant sounded like just another beat in the rhythm of her near-mechanical efficiency. But today, in the assistant's hands, was an ivory envelope thicker than usual, sealed with deep red wax embossed with a familiar family crest. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. Even after 2 decades, she recognized the lines of that emblem as if it had never left her mind. Inside was an invitation to the annual gala hosted by the Ashford Foundation, a lavish gathering where the elite of finance, politics, and Chicago's old families paraded their jewels, their power, and the relationships they believed untouchable. Camille neither smiled nor frowned. She looked at the card for a few seconds, then set it down on her desk as if it were just another contract among many. But inside her something began to stir, slow, quiet, deliberate. What made this invitation different from the others she had ignored over the years was the bold line beneath her name. Camille Westbrook, Chief Executive Officer of Westbrook Innovations, Guest of Honor and Strategic Partner in the Ashford Vision Initiative, a project valued at $1.2 billion. They don't remember she thought, her eyes skimming the printed words. They don't remember the girl who once walked out of that house with wine dripping down her dress. Or maybe they do and they think time has erased it. Maybe in their eyes the Camille of today has no connection to the girl from 20 years ago, because they never imagined she would be the one to return to the game, let alone take a seat at the center of the board. And somehow, that forgetting made her feel strangely at ease. Their amnesia was her advantage. It allowed her to walk back into the very place that had once tried to erase her, not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone holding the final say. The Ashford Vision Initiative was no small endeavor. With a budget exceeding $1.2 billion, it was being marketed as a sweeping reimagination of the city's downtown, a high-tech hub integrating commerce, education, and entertainment, an urban dream forged in ambition. And Camille was the last piece they needed to bring it to life. Westbrook Innovations held the financial tech, the data architecture, the tools no other firm could offer. Ashford needed her. They needed her credibility, her network, the moral assurance that the Westbrook name now carried in every serious financial circle across the country. What they didn't know was that Camille had been preparing for this moment for years. Since the earliest days of building her company, she had quietly tracked every movement within the Ashford empire. She knew about the internal audits, the tangled debts, the risky investments wrapped in polished ethics. She knew that when the timing was right, everything would come to the surface. This invitation wasn't just a request, it was a doorway back into the very world that once tried to shut her out for good. Only this time, Camille was not an uninvited outsider. She was invited, welcomed, expected. And what they failed to understand was this: when you open the door and let someone you once tried to drown sit at your table, you place your entire empire at a risk no model can forecast. Camille sat down, picked up a pen, and wrote a single line in the corner of the card. I will attend, not to be seen, but because it is time for them to finally see what they refused to look at 20 years ago. From the highest floor of the Westbrook building, Chicago looked like a flawless painting, its roads intersecting with surgical precision, the lights of the skyscrapers glowing like the electric pulse of a city that never sleeps. But Camille knew better. That brilliance was only a shell. Beneath the lights lay sharp, invisible boundaries where class and race still operated like silent gears no one dared to name. In the past 20 years, the city had changed labor neighborhoods, replaced by luxury complexes, family-run diners erased to make space for upscale coffee chains and boutique gyms. People called it development, urban renewal. But Camille understood that this progress wasn't for everyone. It simply shifted old borders into new forms, more refined, more calculated, and far colder. She had sat in those strategy meetings with developers who used words like revitalization and infrastructure improvement, when what they truly meant was removing low-income families from the only homes they had ever known. No one spoke it out loud, but everyone understood. In Chicago, you didn't need a financial report to tell who belonged to which class. You only had to look at their clothes, see where they stood in a room, and most of all, notice who listened when they spoke. Camille had spent her entire career walking through doors society had never intended for someone like her to enter. A black woman without aristocratic titles, without a prep school pedigree, not a founding member of any elite board. Every seat she had occupied was claimed not through connections, but through being better, sharper, more patient than those born into places she had to fight to reach. But what weighed on her now was not her own journey. It was the knowledge that even today there were thousands of other Camilles still standing outside those doors. Not because they lacked talent, but because this society had quietly told them they did not belong. The Ashford Vision Initiative, the grand project the Ashford family was preparing to launch, was being marketed as a symbol of Chicago's future. But Camille saw it for what it truly was, a redevelopment campaign, where the voices shaping the new city were the same voices from the old one. The same people who had laughed as red wine was poured over her now sat at the heart of the vision for a new metropolis. And once again, they were molding the future in the image they had always believed was best. Camille was not opposed to progress. She believed in change, but she didn't believe in change that served only one side. That's why she accepted the invitation, not to collaborate, but to oversee, not to be acknowledged, but to confront. Because she knew that in Chicago, inequality no longer needed to speak aloud or hang its name on a sign. It revealed itself in who was seen and who was passed over, in who was invited into the room, who was given the power to decide, and who was told quietly, politely to stay silent. And Camille had never learned how to stay silent when injustice came dressed in silk and fine wine. She was not dazzled by luxury, because she had once been the child who had red wine poured on her head at the center of a gala. And from that moment forward, she had learned to see through the shine, to separate real power from the costume of a society that refused to face itself. The gala that year was held at the Langham Hotel, where marble columns and soaring ceilings seemed crafted solely to frame the superiority of the elite. Beneath the glitter of crystal chandeliers, everything was arranged with such precision, such practiced elegance, that it gave the illusion nothing could fracture its cold, immaculate grace. But Camille knew the truth: perfection, by its very nature, is fragile. She stepped into that space wearing an emerald silk gown, the cut classic, and restrained each seam tailored not for display, but for command. She hadn't come to be admired. She came to see clearly. There were handshakes, polite greetings, eyes that scanned her face, quickly recognizing who she was, and just as quickly adjusting their posture, their tone. Clarissa Ashford stood near the center of the room, her hair still curled with meticulous care, just as it had been 2 decades ago. But the confidence in her eyes had begun to fade. Gregory remained silent, moving slowly as though time still answered to him. And beside them stood Chase, now 38 tall, dressed like a young gentleman heir, yet carrying that same familiar smirk that once belonged to a boy who believed the world existed to amuse him. Camille glanced at them as if they were simply part of the decor. No one more important than the other, no one worth pausing for. The night moved on, filled with speeches about vision and renewal, laced with promises of inclusion and community repeated so smoothly, one could almost believe that trust could be built on nothing but elegant vocabulary. Camille said little. She simply watched, until Chase approached, wineglass in hand, and the spotlight above them flickered like fate holding its breath. He smiled, not with courtesy, but with a hint of provocation. Camille stood still. She felt the subtle shift of his arm, the shimmer of red liquid catching the light, the moment of suspended silence before everything tipped. And then it happened. The wine slipped from his hand and splashed across the front of Camille's gown. It spread fast, soaking into the fine silk, and once again the room froze. But this time there were cameras, dozens of them. Flashbulbs ignited like lightning across the ballroom. The press had been invited. This was a media-covered event. And now they were capturing every angle of the moment. Camille did not blink. She did not step back. She did not lower her head. She simply stood there, her gaze locked onto Chase. No tears, no outrage, just an unsettling absolute stillness. A young woman moved forward instinctively, reaching to dab at the wine. Camille lifted her hand gently, firmly. No. The room remained motionless. No one knew what to do. Clarissa flinched, then forced a smile, her hand gripping her clutch as if trying to regain a sense of control. Gregory said nothing, but his eyes moved slowly through the crowd, measuring the damage. Chase opened his mouth perhaps to offer some version of an apology, but Camille stepped forward just half a pace, enough to silence the entire room. The light struck her face, clear and unforgiving. I hereby withdraw all commitments between Westbrook Innovations and the Ashford Vision Initiative. Her voice was not raised. She did not need to raise it. Each word sliced through the air with the precision of a blade. The room held its breath. Then came the noise, the staccato of camera shutters, the murmur of whispers, the vibration of phones lighting up with alerts. PR consultants began rushing toward the center of the room. Clarissa's face drained of color. Gregory moved toward her, but no one could stop Camille now. She did not walk away as she had 20 years ago. She stood still. And this time, they all had to listen. The gala had become a scene. No one spoke of the project anymore. No one smiled. Everyone stood in the shadow of a truth they could no longer undo. History had repeated itself, but the roles had reversed, and this time the one soaked in red wine was no victim. She was the woman with the power to end it all. The air in the room had thickened so dense it felt as though it could be cut with a blade. The shallow laughter died off mid-breath, and the glances that had once slid past Camille now fixed on her, not with polite curiosity but with astonishment and quiet alarm. The emerald silk gown, still marked by a spreading red stain like blood on fabric, remained uncovered. Camille made no move to hide it, no sign of embarrassment. She stood tall, silent at the eye of the storm, and did not blink. Beyond the ballroom, the doors to the press area began to creak open. Photographers who had lingered to catch last shots of the gala sensed something was unfolding. Within 15 minutes, the first headline broke. Powerful CEO cuts ties with Ashford's $1.2 billion deal mid-gala. The story erupted like wildfire. Across social media, images of Camille's stained dress, steel-sharp gaze, and the unwavering words that ended a multi-million-dollar partnership spread in real time. Within hours, millions had seen the clip. But in the midst of the uproar, what stunned the public wasn't just the act itself. It was the way Camille did it. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't collapse into the role of a victim. She gave no one the chance to pity her. There was only a decision, clear, final, and impossible to ignore. No second chances, no more tears. By dawn, Camille sat in her office, surrounded by the quiet hum of a city just beginning to wake. Her screen lit up with missed calls, urgent meeting requests, and dozens of interview invitations. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened a single document, the Memorandum of Agreement with the Ashford Vision Initiative. She placed her hand over the delete key. One press, that was all. And with it, every contract, every month of negotiation, every polished plan the Ashfords had meticulously crafted vanished. She didn't need them. And what they never expected, what they could never calculate, was that Camille wasn't afraid to walk away from the promises they had dangled in front of her. Somewhere else in the city, Clarissa hurled her phone into an armchair, her fury loud and uncontrolled. Gregory sat in silence, his brow furrowed, calculating fallout and next steps. Chase, strangely quiet, said nothing, perhaps beginning to understand that the storm wasn't caused by his wine-stained performance. It was caused by the woman he had once thought a target, now revealed to be the storm itself. What terrified them wasn't that Camille had canceled a deal. It was that she had done it in front of hundreds of witnesses under the glare of cameras and without the smallest tremor in her voice. No apology, no explanation, no negotiation. She let the moment speak for itself. The image of a woman, once humiliated in their home, now calmly reclaiming her place, not with vows of revenge, but with the closing of a door they thought she would never dare touch. Not this time. No standing still, no bowed head, no waiting for someone else to decide her worth, and no room for tears. She was no longer the girl who had walked out in silence 20 years ago, heart heavy with something she could not yet name. She was now the one who made an entire room fall silent. The one whose name the media spoke with respect, the one who forced an entire industry to examine the way it treated those it once deemed invisible. Because this time Camille refused to let pain become just another page in history. She turned it into action, and that action was not a tear. It was an ending, one that arrived before anyone else realized. They were never the ones truly in control. The next morning, while news broadcasts replayed the now iconic image of Camille standing in her wine-stained silk gown under the glitter of the gala lights, her voice measured her words. Final. Her presence sending shockwaves through the financial world. An email appeared in her inbox, its subject line simple and stark. I remember that night, and I have what you need. Sender Agnes Daniels. It was a name Camille had not spoken aloud in 20 years, but one she had never once forgotten. Agnes had been the oldest housekeeper in the Ashford estate, a quiet black woman with eyes like dusk and a voice so soft it barely touched the air. When Camille had stood 16 and soaked in red wine and silence, Agnes had been the only one who hadn't looked away. She hadn't stepped forward, hadn't wiped Camille's face, or called out in protest, but the way she had looked at her in that single, unblinking moment was unlike anything Camille had seen that night. It was not pity. It was recognition. Witness. And now she was speaking. Camille opened the message. The words were brief, carefully written, as if first composed by hand and only later typed. I know who you are. I knew it that night. I've stayed silent too long. But I'm ready now. I kept what no one thought I dared to keep. If you're ready, meet me. Come alone, no address, just a landline number rare enough in this age to feel deliberate. Camille stared at the screen, her breath shallow, stirred by a feeling she couldn't name. Agnes had been there, and she had held on to something important enough for a woman who had spent 3 decades in the shadows of the Ashford family to break her silence now. Camille didn't hesitate. She called. The voice on the other end was unchanged, soft, slow, but with a quiet gravity that pulled every word into focus. Agnes gave her an address, a small apartment on the south side, on a block with no gleaming signs where aging brick buildings stood wrapped in their own histories, and wealth had never learned the route in. When Camille arrived, Agnes was waiting at a worn wooden table. A pot of tea sat between 2 ceramic cups, their rims faintly chipped. She didn't smile, didn't feign surprise or warmth. She simply nodded as though this moment had been waiting for them both all along. No pleasantries, no small talk. Camille sat down, and Agnes began. 30 years in the Ashford household, 30 years of seeing more than anyone ever intended to be seen. She had heard the midnight shouting when Gregory lost money and control. She had swept up shards of glass after Clarissa's jealous rages. She had stood in hallways during closed-door meetings where men in suits whispered of shadow funds, off-the-books loans, ways to bend audits and silence oversight. She had never spoken because she knew speaking meant losing everything. But she had written. Little notebooks. Hidden beneath a floorboard in her private room, she had recorded it all. Dates, names, conversations, not to accuse but to survive. And now she was ready to hand them over, because she knew it was time for what had been buried too long to finally come into the light. Camille took the old suitcase without a word. Her hands were steady. No thank yous, no promises, just a look into Agnes's eyes, and in that look everything was said. Agnes knew Camille would do what was right. Camille knew the fight ahead was no longer personal. It was justice for every invisible life that had been used to build a kingdom of silence. This was no longer a reckoning born of one girl's pain. It was a reckoning for a system that had built its empire on the assumption that people like Agnes and Camille would never speak, never fight back. But not anymore. Not Camille, not Agnes. And once the truth finds its way to the surface, no one, not even the Ashfords, can bury it again. The suitcase Agnes Daniels handed Camille that day was not large. Its brown leather had faded with time, the zipper frayed at the corners, worn thin by decades of silence. Yet when Camille placed it on her desk and slowly unlatched it, she knew at once she was opening something heavier than any legal document she had ever handled. Inside were 7 thick notebooks, their leather covers soft from age, the pages yellowed, each one filled with handwritten lines, neat, steady, as if shaped by the breath of someone who had spent a lifetime recording what no one else dared to say aloud. Camille turned each page carefully. Every date was exact, reaching as far back as the early 1980s, the years when Agnes was still a young woman first stepping into the Ashford household, all the way through to just a few months before her quiet retirement. Each entry was a slice of life behind the polished walls of a family that had long convinced the world of its spotless perfection. There were passages detailing the private dinners Clarissa had hosted where racist jokes were told like party tricks. There were records of conversations between Gregory and his private attorney about offshore shell companies used to funnel questionable funds and bypass audits. The names mentioned were not strangers. They were high-ranking figures in finance, local politicians, directors of prominent charities. Agnes offered no commentary. She did not judge. She simply wrote, cold, precise, word for word. And that more than anything made the notebooks almost impossibly credible. She wasn't trying to accuse. She had simply survived by remembering. And now those memories had become evidence. In one entry from the year Camille was 16, Agnes described that gala night in chilling detail. She noted how Clarissa had laughed loud and unbothered after the wine was thrown. How Chase had turned to his friend and whispered something with a smirk. How Gregory had motioned to staff to clean the carpet swiftly, ensuring no stain remained. She even recorded his words to her as she knelt to wipe the floor. "We can't let this place reek of failure. It wasn't just a moment of cruelty. It was an ideology deeply embedded and toxic, flowing through every corridor of that house like poison." Camille understood then that what she held in her hands was more than proof of financial misconduct. It was a living archive of a system that had protected exploitation, silence, and deception for decades. She handed everything over to her legal team under the strictest confidentiality. That same night, she assembled an independent investigative unit, financial analysts, corporate crime attorneys, and a former federal agent who had led several high-profile money laundering cases. But Camille also knew this wouldn't be won in courtrooms alone. Not yet. She needed to prepare something greater. She needed the public. She needed to make the world see that this wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. A reckoning long overdue. The story had to be bigger than Camille, bigger than Agnes. It had to become the story of every person who had been pushed to the margins by a system that rewarded those who hid and punished those who remembered. She would turn those faded pages into fire. A fire that could not be extinguished by legal rebuttals or polished press releases. Not this time. This wasn't just Camille's truth, or Agnes's. This was the truth of hundreds, thousands who had been kept outside the rooms where power was passed like heirlooms, and whose silence had been mistaken for consent. And now those notebooks would no longer lie dormant in an old suitcase. They were about to speak, and when they did, their voice would shake an empire to its core. Camille sat alone in her office long after midnight, the lights of the city casting fractured reflections across the glass wall behind her like a curtain of untold secrets. On the desk before her, the notebooks Agnes had entrusted to her were now carefully digitized, encrypted, and stored deep within Westbrook Innovations' internal security network. Every entry time-stamped, every quote cross-referenced with public records and decades of Ashford Corporation's financial disclosures. But Camille wasn't here to chase justice only through legal channels. She hadn't come this far to reclaim dignity just for herself. Not this time. She knew that what she held wasn't just the power to destroy a deal. It was the power to pull an entire dynasty into the depths. And she was ready to do it not for revenge, but for all the people like Agnes who had lived in silence, made invisible inside glowing buildings where no one remembered their names. At the emergency meeting of Westbrook's legal counsel the following morning, Camille stood at the head of the table. Her voice was cold, calm, and exact. No one interrupted. She gave clear directives. Assemble every financial file linked to Ashford's shadow investments. Cross-check Agnes's handwritten records with historical data and audit filings. Prepare a formal complaint for the Securities and Exchange Commission and notify the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. No settlements, no advance warning. Camille wanted the first blow to come from her, and she wanted it to be unstoppable. But alongside the legal strike, she prepared for a second battle, one far more brutal. The media. She knew the Ashfords had their allies, journalists who'd soften a scandal for the right price, columnists who could twist the narrative with a few strategic omissions. That was why she wouldn't rely on filtered press releases or polished PR surrogates. She would speak, in her own voice, directly, unedited. A live press conference was planned, not in the gleaming lobby of Westbrook headquarters, but in an old theater on the south side, a historic landmark that once served as a community gathering place for black families during the civil rights era. It wasn't just strategy. It was a statement. Camille would tell her story not as a scorned party guest or a betrayed executive, but as a living witness to the rot that had long festered beneath the golden skin of power. And she would bring Agnes with her. No longer a nameless housekeeper, but a key witness in an unfolding investigation that could force the financial sector to reckon with its own reflection. Camille understood that truth by itself isn't always the most powerful weapon, but when it is spoken at the right time by the right voice, aimed directly at the heart of where power believes itself untouchable, it can tear through every mask. And that was what Camille intended to do, not to reclaim the past, but to rewrite the future. A future where truth no longer lives hidden in old notebooks, and where silence is no longer mistaken for surrender. A future where no girl has to stand still while others decide her worth. Where no woman has to wait for permission to be heard. Where a spilled glass of wine is no longer the final word, but the first crack in a kingdom built on forgetting. Because this time, Camille wasn't just carrying evidence. She was carrying a reckoning, and the world would have no choice but to listen. News of Camille Westbrook's upcoming press conference spread like wildfire. Within less than 24 hours of her public confirmation that she would speak directly by week's end, every major news network scrambled to secure the rights to broadcast it live. Headlines multiplied, editorials speculated, the city held its breath. But the Ashfords did not stay still. They knew what Camille had in her hands, and they understood the gravity of the name Agnes Daniels and the weight of the handwritten journals that could bury everything they had built, not just a business deal, but an entire legacy. Yet instead of admitting, instead of negotiating, they turned to the weapon most familiar to those long sheltered behind curtains of power. They rewrote the truth. On the third day after Camille's announcement, a video appeared anonymously posted just 2 minutes long. Within hours, it exploded across platforms. The footage showed Camille at the gala, but not as the composed woman standing in silent defiance. In this version, she appeared storming toward Chase, her expression cold, tense. A voice strikingly similar to hers delivered a single sentence. "If you don't apologize right now, I will destroy everything your family has." The voice was chilling, the angle was clean, the context carefully constructed. It didn't take long. The video was viewed millions of times. Talk shows aired it on loop. Commentators debated it. Was Camille seeking justice or vengeance? Neutral analysts began to hedge their praise. Some public figures stood by her, but others leaned into suspicion, framing her as a manipulator in disguise. Even within Westbrook, a few board members began to quietly voice concern. Camille was not surprised. She watched the clip once. Her gaze never flinched. Then she turned to her communications advisor and said simply, "They're playing dirty." The video was a composite stitched from multiple camera feeds, stripped of original context with blurred overlays, cut frames, and deep-fake audio crafted from existing samples of Camille's voice. It wasn't documentation, it was a weapon. But Camille didn't rush to deny it. She understood the laws of public perception. Deny too soon and they'll say you're hiding something. Deny too forcefully and they'll say you're afraid. So she chose silence for one more night. That night, her legal investigation team worked without pause. They cross-referenced the fake video with original security footage from the event footage provided to Westbrook Innovations by the gala's organizing committee just hours after the incident. They hired voice forensics specialists to analyze pitch patterns and spectral frequencies. They brought in a former FBI image analyst to examine frame sequencing, shadows, and visual noise. Every second, every sound, every pixel, and they found everything they needed. By morning, as speculation raged and Camille's name trended under words like threat and manipulation, she posted a single statement. "If they think a cheap cut and paste will silence me, they've underestimated me. See you Saturday." Attached was one image, the cover of one of Agnes's journals, the first page. In Agnes's familiar slanted handwriting, "Every time they thought I wasn't watching, I wrote another page." In minutes, the current began to shift, the critics quieted, the doubters paused, and those who still stood with Camille felt their confidence deepen. She wasn't a woman under attack. She was a woman who had seen it coming, and had prepared her answer not in outrage, not in panic, but in a truth guarded for 3 decades. A truth that didn't need to scream. It only needed to wait, and speak when the time was right. That moment was approaching. Saturday came with a chill that clung to the bones as if winter had arrived early in Chicago. The wind swept through the streets carrying crumpled newspapers with headlines about Camille Westbrook and the video that had split the city in two. But inside a modest theater on the South Side, once a gathering place for civil rights organizers, the air was charged with something else entirely. Every seat from front row to balcony was filled. Journalists, investors, nonprofit leaders, students, elders, strangers. No one wanted to miss what people were already calling the moment of reckoning. The stage lights dimmed. There was no music, no host, no introduction. Camille stepped out alone. No entourage, no fanfare, just a black suit, crisp white shirt, a bare face, and eyes that did not blink. She stood center stage. Behind her there was no corporate logo, just a blank screen. She looked out over the audience, held silence for a few beats, then spoke, her voice low, steady and resonant. I used to believe silence was a way to keep the peace. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, stayed disciplined enough, prejudice would fade on its own. I was wrong. Behind her, the screen lit up. Footage from the gala appeared, the real footage, wide frame, uncut, stamped with a verifiable timeline from the Langham Hotel's security system. The audience watched breathless as Chase poured the wine over Camille, as she stood still, as the crowd stirred around her, and undeniably as no words came from her mouth. No threat, no outburst, just silence, just truth. Camille turned back to face the crowd. That's what happened, not the version designed to flip the narrative, not the one manufactured out of fear. This is the truth. And now it's time you heard another one. She stepped aside. The screen changed to the image of the first notebook, Agnes Daniels's journal, the same one she had shown the world days earlier. Then Camille began to read, not like a lawyer, not like an executive, but like a witness honoring the voice of someone who had been invisible too long. On the third page, Agnes had written, "They think I don't understand what they're doing. They think I'm too old to remember, too quiet to resist. But I don't write to fight. I write so I won't forget." Each excerpt Camille read was followed by evidence documents, payment records, shell company contracts, signed memos, all aligning with Agnes's words, verified, time-stamped, matched, no dramatics, no accusations, just a steady release of facts, methodical and relentless. The calm in Camille's voice made the air in the theater heavier than any cry for justice ever could. Midway through the event, she paused. She looked to the front row. A single empty seat had been left. Then slowly, an elderly woman rose and began to make her way to the stage. Small frame, neatly pinned silver hair, a gray sweater, a cream scarf. Agnes Daniels. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough. The entire auditorium rose to their feet. No applause, no cheers, just solemn silence, as if truth itself had just been granted its rightful place. Camille turned back to the microphone. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this so women like Agnes no longer have to write in the dark. So silence is no longer what protects power. So no other girl has to stand frozen beneath a glass of red wine in the gaze of people who believe they stand above consequence." She paused. No one moved. No phones buzzed, no keyboards clicked, just the soft sound of breath held by hundreds who could no longer look away. When it was over, Camille took no questions. She turned, bowed gently to Agnes, and together they left the stage. The media exploded. News stations played the full speech uninterrupted. Fact-checkers released point-by-point breakdowns of every piece of evidence shown. And perhaps most crucially, public opinion began to shift, dramatically. No one called her the vengeful woman anymore. They called her the woman who brought the truth to light. And once the Ashfords' carefully curated mask of virtue was pierced dead center in the heart of their legacy, there was no salvaging the rest. The battle had begun, but Camille hadn't just reclaimed her voice. She was reclaiming justice. Just hours after Camille Westbrook's live press conference, the headlines changed. Gone were the speculative phrases, "Is this revenge?" and overreaction, replaced by stark, bold statements. Undeniable proof. Agnes Daniels's journals expose hidden financial network, Ashford empire on the brink. But the true earthquake came not from the media's shift in tone, but in what followed. Less than 24 hours after Camille's broadcast, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission launched a formal investigation prompted by the extensive documentation Camille's team had submitted. These weren't fragments. They were surgical in scope, fabricated accounting ledgers, evidence of money funneled into shell companies in Bermuda, and the Cayman Islands transcripts of meetings between Gregory Ashford and high-level political figures. Ashford's allies scattered almost instantly. Continental Bank announced a pause on all funding tied to the Ashford Vision Initiative. Major trust funds opened internal reviews of any involvement. A philanthropic organization that once honored Clarissa Ashford removed her name from their wall of distinction within 24 hours. But what stunned the financial world wasn't the speed, it was the scale. Camille hadn't released a few damning pages. She'd submitted an airtight dossier, cross-referenced databases, synchronized timelines, authenticated testimony, and scanned pages of Agnes Daniels's journals, each line backed by contracts, bank records, and legal identifiers. It was digital secure and delivered simultaneously to federal investigators, tax enforcement, and global anti-money laundering watchdogs. A major financial scandal was forming. Inside the Ashford family, cracks began to spread. Chase, once the teenage boy who poured wine on a girl in silk, and more recently a man who repeated that act in front of cameras, disappeared from public view. His social accounts went dark. Close contacts claimed he was under legal supervision, confined to his estate with lawyers at his side. Clarissa, once the poised matriarch who glided through red carpets with practiced disdain, was spotted leaving a shareholders' meeting pale and shaken. And Gregory, once the untouchable patriarch, vanished from the public eye altogether. Spokespeople stepped in but offered nothing substantial, just the same hollow phrase: "We are cooperating fully and will defend the Ashford name by every legal means." But the Ashford name no longer held the shield it once did. Within a week of Camille's speech, Ashford Group's stock collapsed, losing nearly half its market value. Major shareholders demanded an emergency meeting to review Gregory's role. Rumors of an internal coup gained traction. Whispers of resignation turned into closed-door negotiations. And still the aftershocks spread. Tech firms previously funded by Ashford Vision Initiative fell under scrutiny. A major bank whose board included a longtime friend of Clarissa faced audit. Even the accounting firms that had once rubber-stamped Ashford's glowing financials now stood accused of negligence or worse, complicity. This was no longer a family crisis. It had become a systemic unraveling. While media outlets scrambled to keep pace with developments, Camille said nothing. Not one additional word after her press conference. She let the truth do what it was built to do, work quietly and relentlessly. Her legal team, meanwhile, never paused. They filed for federal witness protection for Agnes Daniels. They began preparing a report for Congress on regulatory blind spots that the Ashford case had illuminated: loopholes in investment law, gaps in financial oversight, systemic failures that allowed wealth to silence accountability. Online, Camille Westbrook became a symbol. Clips of her speech were posted with captions like, "Power without integrity is nothing." Her story, from a 16-year-old humiliated in silence to a woman bold enough to dismantle an empire, was shared millions of times. Law students analyzed it in classrooms, professors hosted public forums, civic groups drafted proposals for tighter financial ethics legislation. But among all the voices rising, one stood out: Agnes Daniels. In her one and only televised appearance, she didn't cry. She didn't call herself brave. She simply said, "I didn't do anything grand. I just wrote down what shouldn't be forgotten. And if those pages mean someone else doesn't have to live in silence the way I did, then every word was worth it." It was a quiet blow to the industry's self-image, a reminder that what they called stability had for decades rested on the backs of the unseen. Camille didn't just fracture the Ashford legacy. She forced an entire system to look in the mirror. Not with rage, not with spectacle, but with truth, with steadiness, and with a silence that no longer meant surrender. The quake was still spreading, and it would not stop at a single name. It would reshape a culture that had long believed itself safe in the dark. At 6 o'clock on a Monday morning, the sky above Chicago was a dull, oppressive gray, as if foreshadowing a day that would be anything but ordinary. The early morning news had barely begun when a breaking announcement cut through the broadcast. FBI agents had arrived at the private residence of the Ashford family, nestled within the guarded estates of River Forest, to execute arrest warrants for 3 senior members of the Ashford Group. Television footage from a hovering news helicopter captured every second as the heavy iron gates swung open and a convoy of black government-plated vehicles moved silently into the compound. There were no sirens, no hurried motions, only a presence that was unmistakable. This was no longer a warning. It was a reckoning. Gregory Ashford was led out in handcuffs, wearing a white dress shirt beneath a house robe, his face pale, his eyes vacant. Clarissa was escorted down from the second floor, her expression frozen, one hand still clinging to her phone as if one final call could undo everything. Their son Chase, much younger in appearance than his 20-something years, followed last. He offered no resistance. He simply bowed his head and walked through the line of reporters without saying a word. That morning, across the nation, images of a once unshakable family at the pinnacle of Chicago's elite being taken away under the pale light of dawn sent shockwaves through every living room. Within hours, the official charges were made public. Gregory faced 7 indictments, including money laundering, securities fraud, market manipulation, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Clarissa was charged with financial fraud, complicity in concealing illicit funds, and using a charitable foundation as a front to move assets. Though not yet in an official position, Chase was detained for further investigation tied to data manipulation and laundering activities run through a subsidiary. That same day, the United States Attorney's Office in Chicago held a press conference. The chief prosecutor did not deflect. He declared that the Ashford case was not just a family scandal, but a glaring example of how power can be systematically abused to bury wrongdoing. He named Camille Westbrook as a key witness and extended his gratitude to Agnes Daniels for the courage to preserve a memory no one wanted to remember. When asked whether the investigation would expand to include other parties, he offered only this: no one is immune. Every contract, every call, every trace would be followed. The ripple from the arrests tore through the financial sector like falling dominoes. Companies that once collaborated with Ashford swiftly issued statements ending all affiliations. Auditing firms that had validated their financial reports were summoned. Even figures in the political arena began to surface in internal investigations. And through the chaos, Camille remained absent. No statements, no appearances. The only record was her car leaving the Westbrook office by day's end, heading south. She had nothing more to say. Her actions had spoken. Within Westbrook, the atmosphere was electric. Staff stayed late by choice, circulated legal analyses, held internal briefings to track developments and shield their legal team from mounting pressures. Online, a haunting juxtaposition emerged. A photograph of 16-year-old Camille standing beneath a shower of red wine placed beside footage of Gregory Ashford being led from his home by federal agents. On one side, humiliation, on the other, collapse. And at the center, Camille Westbrook, not as a victim, but as the one who through her long silence had rewritten the rules. Veteran journalists hailed it as the most pivotal moment in the regulation of private power in the United States in over a decade. Law professors added the case to their curriculum as a landmark study in transparency and ethical governance. But to Camille, it was never just a personal triumph. She understood that if exposure was the end, it would all fade like every scandal before. She needed to make this fall the foundation of something better, something that would outlast verdicts. And in the most turbulent days of the ordeal, she was quietly preparing for what came next. A step not for herself alone, but for all those who had lived under the shadow of power and never dared to speak. Camille understood more than anyone that justice cannot live in court orders alone. It must breathe in communities, and she was ready to give that justice a solid home. 3 weeks after the arrests that sent shockwaves through the country while preliminary hearings unfolded in federal courtrooms, and the headlines remained saturated with the Ashford name, Camille Westbrook reemerged. She did not appear in a press conference, nor at the steps of a courthouse, but at a quiet, dignified ceremony held in the heart of Southside Chicago. That day marked the inauguration of the Agnes Daniels Institute for Business Ethics, an independent nonprofit founded by Camille and initially funded by a $15 million endowment drawn from her personal earnings at Westbrook Innovations. There were no throngs of reporters, no staged moments of publicity. The guests in attendance were educators, former civil servants, representatives of nonprofit organizations, and, most notably, those who had once worked in the shadows of corporate empires. They were the ones who swept offices, drove company cars, managed schedules, and remained invisible to power while bearing witness to the things no one ever spoke of. Seated in the front row was Agnes Daniels, her frame still slender, her eyes deep with the weight of memory. She had never been comfortable in the center of attention, but Camille did not allow her to sit in the dark. When Camille stepped onto the stage, she did not speak of the Ashfords, nor did she mention lawsuits. Instead, she told a simple story of a woman who quietly wrote in old notebooks, her handwriting steady and deliberate, leaving behind not bitterness but irrefutable truth for those who would come after. Camille spoke gently. "Some legacies are not built of stone," she said, "but of unseen resolve." Agnes had never spoken at press conferences. She had never debated on television. But she was the first to believe that truth was worth preserving. And today we lay the first stone for a place where every small voice carries weight. Named in her honor, the Agnes Daniels Institute for Business Ethics would serve as a sanctuary for whistleblowers in the financial and corporate world. It would offer free legal counsel house, a repository to document and analyze patterns of misconduct and educate the next generation of business leaders with a focus on human dignity and transparency. This was not a gesture. It was a beginning. Camille had invited a coalition of scholars from leading universities to design a practical ethics curriculum, one that would be introduced into public high schools and colleges across Chicago. A new scholarship also bearing Agnes's name was announced that very day, intended for law and economics students who had been victims or witnesses of labor injustice. When Agnes was invited to speak, she stood silently for a few seconds, her hands trembling slightly, her gaze sweeping the room as though searching for something long lost. Then, in a slow, steady voice, she said, "I once believed I was just a shadow in someone else's house. But Camille showed me that even a shadow, if held long enough, can become a path to the truth. I do not need my name remembered. I only ask that we remember silence should never be taken for granted. Every word I wrote was not to accuse, but to protect those who could not yet speak." The room rose as she stepped down. There was no applause, only quiet reverence, the kind that mirrors the life Agnes had lived. In the days that followed, the moment was hailed as the dawn of a new standard in American corporate culture, a shift in which the voices of workers would no longer be buried beneath financial power. Major corporations began internal audits, revisited whistleblower procedures, and expanded budgets for ethics and social responsibility departments. The Agnes Daniels Institute became a refuge for those who had long hesitated to come forward. Handwritten letters, anonymous emails, testimonies quietly arrived day by day. Camille, though the founder, remained a rare presence at the Institute. She allowed it to move forward by the strength of its purpose, not her name. In a rare interview, she said, "This is not a place for me to perform. This is a place where people can find their voice." Silence has been the most terrifying accomplice of all, but if we turn it into the starting point of justice, it becomes our greatest strength. Agnes's legacy does not lie in the notebooks she once filled. It lies in the fact that today they are no longer forgotten. And for Camille, that was the true victory, not in winning justice for the past, but in giving power to the future. March in New York still clings to its winter chill. Snow melts slowly on the limestone steps leading into the main hall of Columbia University, where a ceremony in honor of Camille Westbrook is about to take place. This is not an event for investors. There are no cameras flashing endlessly, no expensive suits jostling for position on a red carpet. It is an academic gathering, solemn and still, where people come not to celebrate a victory but to bear witness to a journey. And for Camille, it is the first time in many months she allows herself to pause. When she steps up to the podium, she carries no lengthy speech, no formal words of gratitude. Instead, she tells a story that perhaps only she and a few others have ever truly known. It is about that morning when she was 16, leaving a gala in a soaked silk dress, the scent of red wine clinging to her skin, winding into her hair, and a numbness in her chest like someone had crushed her heart and left it hollow. She did not cry then. She only remembers walking for what felt like hours along the stone path by the Chicago River, clutching a broken hair clip her mother once gave her. The clip had snapped as if to mark the end of the girl she used to be. In her speech, Camille does not hide the years when she faltered. There was a time early in her career in finance when she tried to mold herself into a version Wall Street would accept, colder, quieter, unflinching in the face of condescension. She even hesitated once before signing an internal policy to protect vulnerable employees, fearing it would make her seem too soft in the eyes of investors. She sacrificed her own voice to keep her seat in rooms of power, but that sacrifice only left her hollow. Success, she realized, cannot save anyone if it demands you abandon who you are. And the second spill of wine 20 years after that fateful night awakened her from a dangerous dream. No one else would ever define Camille again but Camille herself. She speaks of the moment when Westbrook's stock dropped sharply after she publicly withdrew from the deal with Ashford. Some called it foolish. Others warned that she had lost the market's trust. One shareholder even declared openly that they would sue her for financial loss. She faced the very real risk of losing everything she had built. But rather than retreat, she chose dialogue. Camille wrote handwritten letters to each major shareholder, explaining not with cold numbers, but with the ethical foundation of her decision. And something unexpected happened. Her honesty made it impossible for them to walk away. Some reinvested, others stayed silent, but the threats of lawsuits quietly disappeared. Westbrook Innovations not only recovered, but surged forward with a renewed identity as a leader in ethical business. At Columbia, when her speech ends, Camille does not offer a traditional thank you. She simply says, "I once stayed silent for fear of being cast out. Now I speak so those who come after me may step through the door." As she leaves the stage, the students rise in a standing ovation. But perhaps the most lasting moment happens not inside the hall, but just beyond it, as Camille walks through her old campus grounds. The snow has just melted. The wet bricks beneath her feet reflect the soft light of a late winter afternoon. A young black student approaches her holding a copy of the Agnes Daniels Journal. The young woman says, "Thank you for not breaking when everything was against you." Camille smiles without a word, gently squeezing the girl's hand. In that moment, she is not a CEO, not the woman who brought down an empire, not the girl who was once humiliated beneath chandeliers. She is simply Camille, a person who once fell, who was nearly drowned, but who rose step by step, carrying the silence of her past to build a foundation for future voices. Camille's return is not a victory lap. It is a journey of reckoning, of failure, of hard choices, and ultimately of rebirth. Because sometimes it is the fall that teaches us how to truly stand. And when someone who once kept silent chooses to speak, the world cannot remain the same. 2 months after the Columbia tribute, Camille Westbrook returned to the place where 20 years earlier she had left behind her first footprints on the path of pain. The Langham Hotel, the grand ballroom on the 3rd floor. The chandelier still hung from the ceiling, its crystal arms glittering as if time itself had stood still. But Camille had changed beyond recognition. She walked across the red-carpeted hallway no longer as the 16-year-old girl in a silk dress stained by wine and humiliation, but as a woman in a deep blue gown, high-collared and long-sleeved, understated yet elegant, her gaze as calm and steady as a deep lake. This year's gala, hosted by a coalition of Chicago's charitable organizations, did not hesitate to name Camille its guest of honor. The irony was sharp. The hall looked unchanged, the golden light still dancing across glasses of wine, but the people had. There were no signs of the Ashfords. The chairs that once bore the names Gregory and Clarissa were now held by nonprofit leaders, scholars, independent journalists, and students. And yet Camille remembered every corner, every glance from that night long ago. When the MC introduced her, no one expected Camille to step onto the stage with such a quiet smile. She brought no speech, no prepared notes. She simply stood in the same spot where years ago Chase's mother had once raised a glass, and she began to speak. "I'm not here to reopen a wound. I'm here to say that sometimes the places that once silenced us are the very places that most need to hear our voice." Her eyes moved across the room. In the front row, Agnes Daniels sat among students awarded the scholarship that bore her name. She wore a gray coat, a pin in the shape of a pen fastened to the lapel, her eyes fixed on Camille without blinking. Camille continued, "I do not forgive the past, but I will not let it chain my future. If there is anyone sitting quietly at the back of this room, feeling like they do not belong, please know that I once stood exactly where you are. And now I stand here not because I am better than anyone, but because someone once believed that truth does not have to shout to be heard." She bowed her head and left the stage. No brass band played, no spotlight followed her steps. Only slow, steady applause filled the space that 2 decades earlier had stayed silent as she walked away in shame. And now she returned not for revenge, but to close the circle. The ballroom doors closed behind her, but somewhere else another door had just begun to open. As Camille Westbrook stepped off the stage, the lights had yet to dim, and the MC stood motionless, held in place by a silence that had no name. No one in the room moved. The air itself seemed frozen in the wake of her final words. There had been no accusations, no direct confrontations. Yet it was that very calm, measured unwavering that cut the deepest, a blade of stillness that slid clean through the memories of those who had once sat in this same ballroom years before and chosen to look away. Camille had not spoken of humiliation. She had not named a single soul. But those who had witnessed it, those who had laughed quietly, who had said nothing, None of them could now escape the sting that settled quiet and persistent inside their chests. No names were needed. Her presence alone was a mirror held high, reflecting not just what had been done but what had been left undone. In the front row, Agnes Daniels bowed her head slightly, her hand gently clasping that of a young student beside her. She did not weep, but in her eyes shone a soft glimmer that caught the image of Camille, just as she disappeared beyond the stage, an unspoken acknowledgement that at times the greatest lessons do not come from punishment, but from the quiet courage to choose dignity in the face of cruelty. Some guests left with eyes rimmed red. Others remained standing long after the applause had begun, as if what they had just witnessed had not been a speech, but a verdict, not of law, but of conscience. Later, in an article published in the New York Times, a journalist who had attended that gala 2 decades ago wrote, "Camille did not return to take revenge. She came to teach us all that dignity is not something that can be stolen by the powerful, and that truth, when spoken in the calmest voice, carries the fiercest impact." The final line of her speech was printed in bold at the center of the page. "Power without dignity is only darkness with money, and true light always rises from the places we least expect." When the gala came to an end, Camille Westbrook did not linger for praise or pose for photographs with the guests. She slipped quietly through a side door alongside Agnes Daniels, moving as gently as if unwilling to leave a sound behind. There were no cameras following, no line of admirers waiting for autographs. Only 2 women, one older, one younger, walking slowly down a hallway where warm light pooled onto the worn tiles below. No words were spoken, and yet that silence carried more weight than any applause that had filled the ballroom moments earlier. Sometimes justice makes no noise. It is not a victory parade, not the flash of spotlights or the rush of breaking news. It is a series of small, steady steps taken quietly through a system long accustomed to forgetting. And when someone who was once humiliated, once dismissed, once forced into silence chooses to stand, that system begins to shift, inch by inch. Not through power, but through principle. Not through fury, but through dignity. The story of Camille Westbrook is not merely the toppling of a dynasty. It is proof that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it lives in the quiet persistence of someone who refuses to abandon their values. If you've come this far in the story, perhaps pause for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever stayed silent in the face of injustice because you felt too small to make a difference? And if so, did Camille's story reach you? Did it make you believe even briefly that change does not require power, only conviction? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Who or what did this story make you think of? What part of your own life did it stir? Here at Emotional Echoes, we are always grateful to hear the honest reflections that come from the heart. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing it so these quiet messages can reach more hearts. Until next time, we wish you strength, joy, and peace in every day of your life. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.